Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Larry Starr. I'm the director here at Thomas Jefferson University of the doctoral programs in strategic leadership and in complex systems leadership. This is part of a weekend event in honor of Russell L. Ackoff, our friend, colleague, mentor, and general great guy, if you felt that way about Russ. This afternoon, we're going to engage in what we hope is a not only lively, but informative conversation involving a host of people, led by a significant host. And I'm not going to spend too much time describing the people because all of their information is widely available. But we are going to introduce initially the host of the event, Vince Baraba. And much is written about Vince. He has a widely known and important history. All of this is available online. It's easy to find. But really to introduce him, we think there are some important things that you ought to know that are not widely known, that are relevant to this event. And to that effect, I'm introducing John Portinaud, my colleague here at Jefferson and a member of the faculty of our doctoral programs, to do that introduction. And when that's done, Vince will begin the panel interview and discussion. John Portinaud.
Thank you, Larry. I was thinking, about Vince and his relationship with Russ Ackoff. And two points that I have to make about that. One is that, as most of you who work with Russ know, that he had a hard time admitting that he made a mistake. Right? With one exception, and that was to do with Vince, which I'm going to ask Vince to tell you the story. He can tell it better than I. But Russ was very proud to say that Vince proved me wrong, and it is on the tapes. Now, the second thing was, I guess, was 1995, and Vince, correct me, the book, Meeting of the Minds, was published by Harvard Business School. And I remember that, Russ came into the office and said that, take this book and read it. And I was very surprised because, Russ hardly ever recommended books to other people to read. So I said, okay, Russ, I read it. So I took the book, and 2 days later, he walks in, he says that, did you read the book? And, I said to myself, that, Russ, with my English and, with me, which at that time I was diagnosed by my esteemed psychologist, Dr. Larry Starr, that I had learning disabilities. So, I said, Russ, I haven't finished it. But so I go away 2 days later again. Did you read it? Anyways, this went on for 3 times until he got fed up. This was like 5 days after he had given me the book. And he said that, okay, give it to me. I'll take it. So I gave it to him, and I went and bought the book myself. And one of the things that Russ used to do with us, you would get this very early morning calls. And I'm not an early morning person, so this is like 5 months later. Russ, this was 7 in the morning, and the phone rang, and I knew it's Russ. So I got my voice, all straightened. And I said, good morning, Ross. He said, he used to say that, what's new? And usually my answer to him was that, Ross, do you want me to tell you the truth or you want me to lie? But anyways, I said, Ross, I finished the book. And he said, what book? So I said, Meeting of the Minds. And then he posed and he said that, he used to say that, oh boy, your reading ability is at the second grade level. 5 months to read the book. And for that, I will never forget Vince, because that really hurt my feelings. But, I was also truly have been honored and privileged that Vince put me among the few people that he would send out his manuscript for his books. And I think that the last one, which I guess going to get published in, next 2 days or 3 days, I think Vince had also by this time realized that I'm not very fast reader. So this time, the manuscript of the book came with Vince's instruction that just read the pages 89 to 101. So, but, reading Vince's book has always been, tremendously interesting thing to do, because as many of you know, he has been working with almost who is who in the management sciences. I mean, Peter Drucker, Russ Ackoff, Adrian Slavodsky, C.K. Prahalad, just to name a few. People from Harvard, people from MIT, from Stanford. And what's so interesting about Vince's work is this, that in my opinion, he takes a systems approach to writing his books. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. When you read his work, you kind of recognize some of the elements that, this is like Russ's, this is like, Drucker's work. But when you finish the book, the totality is not the sum of those parts. It's completely something new and exciting. So the other day, I was having lunch with my dear friend Paul Welfer, and I was explaining this to him. And I said that, Paul, I don't know how best I can summarize this, what I told you, And he said that, why don't you quote this from a fellow called George Balanchine, who is supposed to be the father of ballet choreography, who said that there are no new steps, only new combination. And let me tell you, the master of putting these combination in a way that is truly exciting to read is this man, Vince Baraba. And with that, I want to ask Vince to please now resume your duty.
Okay. We have to turn this on.
No, you're good. It's on.
It's on? Okay. Can you hear okay? Okay, good. Well, let me just tell about Russ's only mistake. When I was, in 1973, I had done a lot of political work for the Republican Party throughout the country, and one of my friends at the Republican National Committee asked me if I wanted to become the director of the Census Bureau. I'd been on a couple advisory committees to the Bureau, and I said, oh, yeah, that'd be fun. Let's go do it. And I thought that would be the end of the discussion. Well, The fact that I had very little experience in statistics and in other things of that nature, other than running political campaigns, caught the attention of the professional organizations, the American Marketing Association, the American Statistical Association, a few others, and a guy by the name of Russ Ackoff. And Russ was a member of the American Statistical Association, and he was the person who led the fight by the ASA to oppose my nomination to become director of the Census Bureau. Fortunately, after about a 4 or 5 month discussion, you could call it a discussion, I guess, and several congressional hearings, I was officially appointed to the job. It ends up that the first week on the job was a meeting of the American Statistical Association, of which one of the members was a fellow by the name of Russ Ackoff. So you can imagine how excited I was about going to this meeting. Because here's the guy who was really opposed to my becoming the director, going to be sitting in an advisory committee role. I said, oh, this is going to be fun. And the topic of discussion at that meeting was to talk about the Census Bureau's planning process. And we had the person in charge of that give a presentation, which I thought was pretty thorough and, based on everything I was aware of. So there was a slight pause, and, Russ said, I have a comment to make, and then he just laid out his whole concept of planning, which was, as you can only imagine, profoundly different than the approach we had taken. And unfortunately, at the time for me, it was much better than we were discussing. So I was sitting there saying, oh, this would be fun. So the meeting ended, and I asked him if he would drop by the office because I wanted to chat with him. And he said, sure. And so we sat down. I said, I really thought what you suggested was much better than what we're doing. So could we retain you as a consultant to come in and help us put this kind of a system in place? He said, well, it'd be very unprofessional for somebody to be on an advisory committee, give a suggestion, then get hired to complete his suggestion. And he says, I can't do that. But he did. He said, I have several people who I know who could do it. And I was introduced to Ian Mitroff, who was a student of C. West Churchman's, and a few other people, and they came in and helped us develop the process. And I think you might have seen if you saw the video, Russ says that he said that was the worst mistake I ever made, was opposing Vince's nomination, because I was wrong. And I guess that's the only time he's ever admitted it. But I have no other evidence that he was ever wrong. But that one I knew he was wrong on. But as Johnny knows, that relationship started in 1973, and it just happened throughout my entire career, and it could not have been a more enlightening, and we really had a lot of fun as well. It was a very good experience. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about the series of questions that were put to this grand group here. And one of the first questions that we kind of summarized was, what is your perspective on the individual capacity for developing learning, competencies, practices of systems thinking, and what are the examples? So who on the panel would like to start off the conversation? You don't jump up all at once. I'll start at the end of the day. Oh, go ahead, Cheryl. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll say something. So I think one of the problems that we're facing at the moment in terms of perspectives on individual capacity is that in education it's dominated by stage theories. So there's a view, for example, from Keegan and others in education that systems thinking is the highest level of cognition you can reach, but you have to attain this gradually throughout your lifetime. And only 10% of people ever get there, and if they do get there, they're not going to get there until they're in their 40s. And if Keegan's right about that, and other people who advocate this kind of theory are right, then there are two significant consequences for our work. The first is that we're forever doomed to a tragedy of the enlightenment, that we're doomed to be in a situation where all our colleagues don't get it and they think we're basically living on another planet. The second consequence is that it's pointless teaching systems thinking to the vast majority of university students if they're not going to get it until their 40s. So my experience basically says that that's dead wrong. So we had a great master's program at Hull, which was really created around student-centered learning, where people applied systems thinking in issues that really mattered to them. And we saw students in their 20s go from floundering right at the beginning to really rising to that challenge. It wiped out a lot of the kinds of inequalities people take for granted in a lot of education programs. So a lot of tutors in universities complain about overseas students who can't speak English well enough. That sort of difference was just wiped out by this. So all of the students were performing really well. And I can honestly say in 10 years on teaching on that program, I only had one student who absolutely avoided systems thinking throughout their whole degree. And so I really do think it can be taught.
Yes, and I think it's an important point that you make, is that young people today grew up in an environment that was profoundly different than the one we grew up in. And they have seen how things interact and how the impact of those interactions have on the final outcome of how society reacts. And so it's not really not unexpected that you would expect to see that occur. Anybody want to add to the question?
I would add one thing, which is, I mean, I completely agree about the disagreement with stage theories. I would say one of the things that I am particularly motivated by and hopeful about is, I've really spent some time working as low as, kindergartners, first graders, developing the skills of systems thinking. And what I really have observed is that I actually believe that humans are actually born innately systems thinkers, and it's actually our education system that sort of trains them out of that. I mean, if you're ever around young children, you have your own children, you know that they're insanely curious, they're making connections all the time, they're taking multiple perspectives on things, they're always nesting and connecting ideas and trying to make sense of the world, which is in fact a huge system around them. And then eventually they'll start to realize that they themselves are a system. So I think we're born into systems, and that we need to really, like you're saying, and we also work with graduate students, really try to bring, almost retrain students back into thinking that way and seeing those multiple connections and being more systemic in how they think about whatever it is they're thinking about. It's really sort of content agnostic, in my opinion.
I'd like to.
Yeah, if I can hit on just to tell the backstory of what Laura said, because we're married, if you didn't pick up on the last names. Laura and I actually met through an NSF grant, a National Science Foundation grant, that was interested in taking the theory that I discovered called DSRP and translating it. So Laura's expertise was translational research, and I'm a theorist. And
It's a match made in heaven.
yeah, so, but once Laura spent the first few months, I was teaching doctoral students this like mathematical theory, and I was very challenged even to get them to understand it, of systems thinking, and Laura was listening in on this as part of her new job with NSF on this new grant for a few months, and once she sort of got her head around it, she said, okay, I know what we need to do. And I said, what do we need to do? And she said, we need to go teach kindergartners. And I said, boy, my doctoral students are pretty challenged by this at Cornell, and you want to go teach kindergartners. And she was absolutely right. And we spent the next 10 years teaching kindergartners. And that learning that we did on how to teach kindergartners, and also I use that sort of metaphorically, we taught third graders and sixth graders and eighth graders and ninth graders and everything in between. And today we teach, those same principles that we learn kind of in the kindergarten trenches, across multinational corporations and CEOs and doctoral students and graduate students and everything else. So I think we have a lot of firsthand experience and data that shows that it is learnable, and it's actually simplifiable, and that even little kids can learn very advanced concepts of systems thinking. Maybe the wording that you use is a little different, and the content changes across that spectrum that people are applying, but the underlying theoretical constructs are teachable and learnable at a very young age.
If I can, add one more child story here. Many years ago, my son, who's 27 years old now, when he was, I think, 8 or 9, we were on vacation, staying at a resort, and we had a rain day. And so we were in the resort trying to figure out what to do, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to teach my son some system dynamic simulation modeling. So I pulled out the laptop, because I would still sneak some work in even on vacation from time to time, and open this up, and what do you teach an 8-year-old?
Now you know why I hired Nick.
So what do you teach an 8-year-old? I showed him how to model a home mortgage. And he's listening to this, and he sees that the stocks of equity that are still owed deplete, and the cumulative interest grows. And he had 2 questions for me when this was all done. He goes, Dad, he says, do you realize how much interest you're paying? He says, are you guys okay? And then the second question he had was, why didn't you teach me this a long time ago? Because he really appreciated a tool to see the connections of things. And to this very day, I didn't do any other financial teaching for him, but to this very day, he is aversely against any form of debt. He just does not want to acquire any debt in any way in his life. And I attribute it to that one time when he was shaken. He thought, my God, you guys are spending a lot of money on your home. So that, yeah, students, children at all levels can appreciate and learn and incorporate these connections.
I wish you would have taught me that as well. I could get rid of some of this debt. Any others?
Yeah. I've got another kid story. We were visiting my in-laws in Florida, and our daughter, who was maybe 10 at the time, wanted to play diner. So she made a menu of all the items that were in the refrigerator and served our families, my wife and I and our son, gave us the menu. And our son looks at the menu and he says his favorite meal, a grilled cheese sandwich, was not on the menu. And Allison says, well, I don't know how to make a grilled cheese sandwich. So Wilson says, I'll show you. So later in the afternoon, I said, so did you show Allison how to make a grilled cheese sandwich? And he says, yeah. He says, you only need 3 things. I said, what do you need? He said, bread, butter, and cheese. I said, well, what about a stove? He says, yeah, you need a stove. I said, what about a pan? He said, yeah, you need a pan. I said, what about electricity? He says, yeah, you need electricity too. So I said, how many things do you need to make a grilled cheese sandwich? He says, a lot. So to Laura's point, I think we'd have a great advance if we accepted that we're all systems thinkers. I think this notion that Vince and I are, our panel is exclusive. And that's the thinking that I would see when I would go to conferences. People talk about we're systems thinkers, implying others aren't. I think the bigger question would be, what size system are we looking at, and why do we pick that size? I think to make it exclusive is dangerous. I taught at Northwestern's business school in the late 90s, and one of the things, a couple things I did, inspired by Dr. Deming, who I'd met a few times. And Deming did not give grades to his students. Why? Because grades are a reflection of the system, not the student, taken separately. And so Deming would hand out assignments, but he realized that how well they were doing depended upon him. So I was going to go teach at Northwestern. I asked a friend of mine, I said, so what am I going to do about grades? He says, well, give them all A's. I said, well, I can't do that. He said, why? I said, they won't hire me back. He said, why do you care? So for 4 years I taught, and everyone got an A. But what was amazing is as soon as I took grades off the table, the focus was learning. And there was only one student who got a B, I think a B, maybe a C. And what was neat is I gave them assignments. And my strategy was, if, if anyone shirks their responsibility, the others will call them on it. So I was going to go teach at Northwestern, and Deming did not give grades to his students. Why? Because grades are a reflection of the system, not the student, taken separately. And so Deming would hand out assignments, but he realized that how well they were doing depended upon him. So and this one person did 1 year, he so fell short of what the others were doing that the others called him on it, and I thought, that's what I was looking for. But if you understand that grading is, I think, to Laura's point, I think we come into the world aware of systems, and then we're systematically trained to believe that we cause the grade by ourselves. And that really sets you up to go to work where your performance is caused by yourself. So you go through all of life thinking you're watching, not observing.
Yeah.
I mean, you're observing, not participating. So I think we'd be far ahead if we reinforced what it means as opposed to treating people with glass empty, let me show you. I think what if we explain what we're already doing?
Scott, did you want to?
Yeah, just two attributes that I think are important. I agree with Laura. I think children by design are systemic thinking, and then we spend much of their education process, their formal education, having them unlearn that. But imagination and fun. Starting with, how do we interact? What am I a part of? Is this fun for me? Makes it much easier to see the connections and to realize the shared outcomes that we might have. So echoing everything the panel said, I agree. And I've spent much of my career in institutions of higher education and continue to be shocked and disappointed when we try to extract imagination and fun out of it for the purpose of higher learning. And I think we have an opportunity.
No, it's interesting because reflection that, as you pointed out, these kids start out with a systemic mindset. And then we run them through an educational system that says, I'm going to teach you about all the parts and how you optimize each of the parts. And then we wonder why our companies are run that way.
Right.
And I was, one of the questions that was raised in our earlier discussion is, who would be opposed to us having systemic thinking become the dominant approach to getting things done? That would be those people who, in essence, are in charge of the departments or the sectors or whatever it might be. And so the challenge is going to be how do we get the operating parts of our structures, whether they be government or nonprofits or companies, to see the benefit of creating a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And that's, I think, has got to be a part of what this institute should really be working on, because those things are so well established, and there were so many careers that are not only based on it, but are being based on it, that's going to get in the way of this ever becoming the normal way of doing things.
Can I
Sure.
come in? So I wanted to tell a quick story as well about my daughter, because really as soon as she could talk, she could understand taking multiple perspectives. And it was absolutely built in. And we sometimes have to explain to students in great detail that systems are not absolutely objective. There's a perspective, and it looks different from different perspectives. Children get that. And when we emigrated at one point from the UK to New Zealand, we went into the New Zealand education system. And I was really excited because they have a program in New Zealand where students are learning critical thinking skills. And every single lesson they have to reflect on the thinking skills that they use. So they are learning how to think about thinking. And I thought this was a great idea. And after a couple of months at school, my daughter came home and she looked particularly miserable. And I asked her what she was doing at school. And she said, oh, thinking skills again. And I thought, yeah, an institution knows how to make something that should be absolutely fundamentally important to you dull. And, having fun is a huge part of it, of making it work.
It's interesting. My son is a composer of music, and he's, had to live with his dad's jobs and all the things his dad does and hear all the stories. And one day we were discussing, and he was pointing out that composition is incorporates systemic thinking, because he has, and I, just a month ago, I went to a performance of one of his compositions. I think there was something like 40-plus instruments, and two director, and then two soloists playing saxophones. And it all came together. And it wasn't because they were all doing their own thing. They knew exactly. And he had done it in such a way that he interjected the composition. There were times where he'd have everybody clap their feet so there'd be a different noise. And his idea was to expand the concept of the composition. And I just sat there and I said, wow, I wish I had been that smart. Okay, so any other points on this question?
Well, just following up on what you just said, you used the playing of instruments together. So, at a small college I was at, we had a very good sports program. And some of the students who were not performing in the classroom were performing on the various athletic fields or grids. And interestingly, they could talk about how the interaction of the team members made all the difference for why the play succeeded or how they won. They would also highlight that the team members would come together before a play or before something happened, and they say, okay, you're doing this, and I'm doing that, and you're going there. So they had a sense of the importance of the interaction among the members. And then all of a sudden, we give them an exam in a class. And we give them an exam, and all of a sudden, the same type of stress that you feel on a sports field is lost in the classroom. And it's no longer fun. And you're not winning or losing in a game. You're being deemed smart or not. And that's a shame. That's a shame. So imagination, fun, and the third item I didn't say was purpose. They know what they're doing on a sports field. They don't always know what they're doing in the classroom.
I have a couple questions from the audience. One says, I believe young people today need hope and systems thinking applied to the global systems that global system can give them hope by showing a pathway to world peace. Yeah, your thoughts? That was a simple question.
Well, I'm not sure this will answer that question. I guess at the risk of us having kind of violent agreement, which I always distrust, I would say all of what everybody's saying is true, and I think at the same time that's sort of about the individual child, and if we want to get into the aggregate system, then we as systems thinking people have to get better at measuring systems thinking. Part of our school system in general was built on two things, the agrarian age being kind of a babysitting device and the industrial age being a task and drill device. And our schools are still in those paradigms of babysitting and task and drill. Content is easy to measure because it's easy to test with multiple choices and SAT type tests. And so because we can measure content, we can teach the content. And we're never going to make aggregate change in schools until we can measure thinking. And so we as a discipline have to be better at measuring thinking in ways that are robust, because the world needs adaptive thinking. The world doesn't need you to know the state capital of Texas or things that you can look up on Google. Business leaders, organizational leaders, people that are futurists all know that we need adaptive thinkers for the future of the knowledge age and all that kind of stuff. But if we can't sort of measure in some way, qualitatively or quantitatively, in meaningful ways, thinking, that will never penetrate the aggregation level of the school system.
You mentioned the world stage, which this question addresses, is that it seems to me that the Institute should probably have a section in there that talks about how do we make sure that, let's say we had it really working well in the United States, but it wasn't working well anywhere else. Getting this world peace would be
Right.
not enhanced at all. So a global perspective, I think, is a kind of an interesting issue to consider. That's
Yeah, if the connection wasn't clear, I mean, I think peace is kind of the outcome that we all want
Yeah.
as a big global initiative. And I think for myself, I think like a lot of people do, education is kind of the driver of all things, and Darwin believed the same thing, and he really understood how things evolved. So, but if we don't change schooling in the aggregate, we won't reach that sort of global peace that we're all seeking through some device like systems thinking.
Okay.
So can I add
Yes.
something as well? Because I do think one of the things we absolutely have to acknowledge, and that young people are absolutely aware of this too, is that we are facing existential challenges that no previous generation has had to face. When we're talking about issues like climate change, where it's possible that, for example, the ice caps on the Himalayas could melt, in which case a quarter of the world's population will be without water and food. When you're dealing with situations where large numbers of species are going extinct, young people absolutely have to deal with those issues. And if we're not making systems thinking relevant to those issues, then it will be forgotten.
The other question was from Derek, and it says, what is the relationship between DSRP? You got to help me out there. It's a little bit. What did you mean by DSRP?
That's the theory that I was talking about. What is the question? What is the relationship between the four elements, or?
Between DSRP that you created and Ackoff systems thinking.
Good question. So there's a lot of systems thinking, and when I came to systems thinking, I don't know if you've ever seen that book of is it a chicken or a duck that goes around the farm and says, "Are you my mommy? Are you my mommy?" And he's trying to find his mommy, and none of them are their mom. So when I first came to systems thinking, I really wanted to understand what systems thinking was. And so I just asked the question, what is systems thinking? And I went around the world and asked as many leaders as I could find in the field, what is systems thinking? And over again, I got a lot of answers of like, this is this little part of systems thinking, and this is this framework of systems thinking, and this method of systems. And what I've learned is, there's a huge diversity of systems thinkings out there. And so DSRP is a theory that explains what the underlying universals patterns of thought are that connect all those different frameworks. And so D, S, R, and P are the four underlying patterns of thought that are part of all systems thinking frameworks.
That answered the question. Okay.
So you might need to say what does
Distinctions are identity, other boundaries. Systems are part-whole interactions. Relationships are action-reaction interactions. And perspective are point and view interactions. And then those four things, those four little couplings are like married couples that are all at a dinner party and they're all interacting. So they all interact with each other. And it's like Gerald was saying earlier, we have been plagued, not just in systems thinking, but in the social sciences with stage theories, which are problematic for tons of reasons. Namely, none of them turn out to be true, and the brain doesn't work that way. But what DSRP is doing is more of a complex adaptive system, which is what your brain is doing. It's sort of following simple rules, and the emergent property of that is systems thinking. So it's not a stepwise process. It's not a stage theoretic. It's a set of simple rules that mix and match and combine, almost like the rules of chess or Go or something like that.
All right, well, let's move on to the second question we had, which is, what is your perspective on how to address the challenges of engaging relevant and essential stakeholders in the process of systems thinking? And what are examples? Gerald, you wrote quite a bit on that. Is that in your notes? You want to address that first?
Okay, I can do that if you like. Well, I'll start with something that Russ Ackoff said, which was that you absolutely have to get the decision makers in the room. So that's an important principle, but it's not usually where I would start. So I would usually start by assuming it's not obvious who the stakeholders are and what matters. That if you have a view that the organization is a system and therefore we actually have to look at the stakeholders of this organization, you're already making some huge assumptions about the boundaries of what you're going to look at. So I would be exploring, I always start by exploring different people's views on what matters. So I'm always exploring boundaries to start with. And boundaries define both whose voices should count and what issues will be included. And obviously that means whose voices will be excluded as well or marginalized. So if you push out the boundaries, stakeholder community can change as well. And so a starting point is to consider multiple possibilities for both the inclusion of stakeholders and the issues that concern them. So yes, you do want to make sure that key decision makers are engaged, but you also want to ensure that you're thinking about those who are affected and not just those who are involved. You want to be able to think about issues of marginalization. So just to give you a couple of practical examples, I did a project with homeless children on the streets of Manchester, the UK. And the key principle that we wanted to work with there is we know children are in a marginalized position, especially if they're homeless, living on the streets, because they're going to get involved in petty crime just to survive. So we spent the first 3 months out on the streets at night, getting the perspectives of those children, to put them front and center before we talked to any agency who was going to be developing services. And then we brought the agencies together. We used the voices of those children directly so that they could not avoid that they had to make some commitment to change. So when you have agencies, all of whom could say it's not my problem, hearing about a 12-year-old who's just got involved in prostitution and what that actually feels like, it's compelling. And it's that emotional compulsion that really brought those agencies to the table and to implement the actual plans that were developed by the children and themselves. And I mean, I've just got countless examples like that. So, you know, it's not an either-or, marginalized stakeholders versus decision makers. Actually joining the two up often works best.
You just remind me of a story that Nick will appreciate. We designed the OnStar system at General Motors Corporation. Nick got the assignment of getting the engineering organization to implement it on one of the cars that was coming out in less than a year. And if you understand anything about the engineering of a vehicle that's already is prepared to be made, now you're going to say we're going to change the electronic systems of that vehicle. You can only imagine how they felt about that interesting idea. And so Nick was explaining to them why it was important. And but they were just saying, no. They said we could do one car, and I think it was 4 years. And Nick was saying that all 5 years. And Nick was saying that we're going to do all our cars in 2 years. And so after this went on a while, one of the engineers said, let me just see if I understand what I think you said, Nick. He said, normally we make a part and we put it on the car and we charge the customer how much it costs us to put it on there and a profit. And we get that at the time we sell the car. And he said, yeah. He says, what you're saying is that we're going to put a part on the car for free, and then every time they use it, the cash register is going to ring back at GM. And Nick said, yeah, I think that's the way it's going to be. He says, that's worth taking some risk for. And so it was an example of getting them, the people who actually had to do something, to understand the implications of taking this risk, which was great. And it led to the introduction of this concept years earlier than we ever believed it could possibly happen. Any other points on this issue?
So I'm going to kind of build on both of these. So I had the unique distinction of working for Vince in the corporate environment for many, many years and got a chance to work on many challenging problems. And I used to tell, and then I ran the group for a long time, the strategy group, and I used to tell our analysts and our staff members that doing this important work for the company is like playing pinball. Because what happens when you win at a pinball game? And the answer is you get to play again. And so we earn our right to work on the hardest problems in the company by actually solving them effectively. So this notion of decision makers is absolutely critical. And so we had a very specific definition of what a decision was. a decision was an allocation of resources. And so through issue raising and interview sessions, you get a sense of what the boundaries might be, could be, should be, and who are the owners of the resources that would have to get allocated in a different way in order for a solution to get implemented. And then you work with those teams to work through the framing of the problem. Are we actually working on the right problem? Are the boundaries set properly? What are the policy constraints that the corporation has imposed? What if we were to relax some of those policies for this particular intervention to test out these different scenarios, to test out these different alternative approaches? And that process is very important. But what we did not do is we did not come in saying, we're going to apply systems thinking tools to solve problems that are important. What problems have you got us to work on? No, we were actually going to work on very important problems, and we brought the right tool set, the right toolbox to bear. So imagine today if, you're in your organization and some, young person comes in and says, hey, I got this really, really cool software package called Excel. I could build spreadsheets, and look how important and elegant these spreadsheets are. And let me show you how spreadsheets work, and I'd love to work on your problem using spreadsheets. You're going to throw them out of the room because, don't come with a hammer looking for nails. And so organizations who have really challenging problems to solve instinctively can tell when there's a tool agenda going on. And so we never had tool agendas. And so this question or this issue of are you working on the right boundaries, I've got one example, and actually I was going to talk about OnStar later, I think for the third question, but it occurred to me, so when my wife and I were, young family, starting our family, we were very mired in our work, careers, and everything, and we felt that we were not as involved in our church as we believed we should be. And so the church that we belonged to was going through a major capital improvement, and they had all kinds of committees to work on, and we said, hey, let's join some committees. And so, I decided I'm going to stay in my geek mode. I'm going to join the technology and the computer upgrade committee. And so I went to the first meeting, and a bunch of people were sitting and chatting on a Tuesday night for 2 or 3 hours, and nothing happened. And I figured, well, I'm new. I don't know the background. So I went to the next week's meeting, and after 2 or 3 hours of chit chat, nothing happened. And at the beginning of the third meeting, I says, I'm a kind of an internal consultant in my company, and I help bring some order to things, and this is a problem that we have. Maybe we can do and I wanted to do an idealized design of what the technology footprint for the church and the school ought to be. And so I said, let me put some structure to this. And they said, that'd be fantastic. And so the next 3 hours were amazingly productive, and we got through some scenarios, and we got through some strategy tables and some issue raising, and we got through, everybody had marching orders and assignments, and everybody was excited. And at the end of that session, the priest who was on the committee, he walked me out to the parking lot, and he said, that was amazing, but I never want to see you do that again. And I said, why? He goes, maybe for the church council I could use some of your skills, but he said, these guys don't have a reason to meet for the next 2 or 3 weeks, and this is like 90% social, okay? And so you are solving the wrong problem. So, boundaries are critical.
So Vince, when I looked at this question, I looked at it from a slightly different perspective. I was thinking about once you have the right sort of stakeholders in the room, I was thinking about what's the process by which you engage them? Like what do you need to do in terms of changing the mindset of the sort of the problem-solving process? And one of the things that we teach a lot to our graduate students is, you need to, first of all, come into it moving away from sort of a bivalent way of thinking about things, that there are many possible answers or solutions. Another thing that we really focus on with our students is taking a systems view rather than a blame-based paradigm when there are issues in an organization or any sort of social issue that they're working with. And that the first thing they have to do is seek to understand the system itself before they try to solve the problem. Because a lot of times our students will come and they'll say, I'm going to solve the problem of poverty in Panama. And then they start, deconstructing all the parts and pieces, but they haven't really looked at the entire system and all of the elements that are involved. And I think that is really in line with, I think, one of the things that I was rereading some of the things from Ackoff, and one of the things he said is you don't seek to solve the problem. First, you seek to sort of redesign the elements of the system that caused the problem. And so I think it's not just getting the right people in the room, but really changing the mindset of the process itself before you even start. And I think, I know it sounds simple, but when we say to our students, stop, let's understand this first, and then let's try to isolate sort of the leverage points in the system that can address the issue or the problem that you're looking at.
Any other comments? All right.
Oh, well, I've got one, but I wanted to highlight something. A reaction I often get, some pushback to this kind of stakeholder engagement, is I'll often get agencies saying, we want you to be representative. You know, how do we know that the stakeholders you're going to bring in the room are representative? And I said, well, you know, if you want to survey the population and you want to find out what proportion of people think this or that, then you need a representative sample. But we're not actually looking to survey people's thinking. We want to develop people's thinking, in which case it matters less to be representative than it matters to have people who are committed and want to achieve change in the room. And then you get the real agenda, why they're so concerned about representation, because what they're really concerned is that they can't deal with these people who are loud and angry, and they actually want to stop those people dominating the process. So then what I would like to say to them, and never can, is that's because you're doing your engagement wrong, and you're making people angry by marginalizing them, so they shout louder, and then they shout louder, so you marginalize them more, and then it's a vicious cycle. So I can give you an example from a housing project where we were looking at idealized design of housing for older people. And we worked in residential housing with the older people themselves, and all the people who were so-called the loud voices mixed in with those older people. And the agencies were amazed. They were saying, so, you know, this idealized design is pretty similar to our own. This is implementable. And you got all these loud, shouty people in the room, and they did something constructive. And it actually allowed that engagement to happen.
Yeah, I think the issue of stakeholders is really an important part of getting something done with systemic thinking. And a lot of the work that we did at GM was when we listed the stakeholders, we also had to list assumptions we made about those stakeholders. And then when you looked at the assumptions, were you really covering the issue by that level of understanding of what were the positions of those stakeholders? So the representation is about the ideas, not the organizations. I think that's your point, and it's a very important one.
If I could follow up on that, something that I continue to remind myself with when I go into groups and hope that we will take on an issue is identifying the shared outcomes. So certainly the engagement, but you know, the speed and urgency in which something is embraced depends often on the outcomes. Are they aligned? Are they shared? And the pragmatic acknowledgement that, in effect, when you go down a systems path, you are describing a pathway for change. And change is hard. But those shared outcomes, so here's an example. In the case of a small liberal arts college that was in a community that was failing, we had to bring more students into the residence halls. The community was resistant to have residence halls within a desirable location closer to the downtown community. At the same time, storefronts were boarded up rather than thriving small businesses with coffee shops or the like. Interesting how shared outcomes came together when students said, well, we want a place to go. And the townsfolk would say, well, what do you mean? Where do you want to go? Well, we'd like a coffee shop. Can we do it? And the theater, you know, is dying and decrepit. Could we put on our performances there rather than in the basement of a building on campus? So, you know, identification, the discovery, if you will, of those shared outcomes could make all the difference in some of these engagement opportunities.
Okay, well, let's now move to
A question in the audience, please.
Oh, yes, yes.
I do consulting using Ackoff methodology. But I imagine some of the panels here it looks to me that you are from academicians. In academic, using Ackoff methodology or showing an implementation is not acceptable. Because they public in that area, they say it's not enough contribution.
If you what?
If you publish, first of all, you cannot publish in the top tier journals because it's not that much contribution. Just showing an implementation, I'm not questioning that's not good. Again, I mentioned that I use that methodology and I believe in it and I do it for consulting, but not for academics. The reason is that they say that it is not that much contribution. Nowadays, if you are academicians, for example, in my area, which is operation management, we have certain journals. You cannot publish in every place. You have to publish in management science or operation research or PALMS or Informs or in those. And those journals want very, very specific contribution in one specific area so that they accept that. The systems thinking is very general. I'm not, again, this is the third time, I'm not questioning system thinking, but it is not acceptable with majority of the journals and top publications. I don't know about your areas, maybe you are in a different area, but I'm in operations and in my case, unfortunately, nobody takes that. Unless it's a, third tier journal or fourth tier journal, like Informs, I'm sorry, not Informs, some other journals, okay? So what is your solution for that? Especially if you have, for example, students that are in academics and they are in PhD students. The question for master students, it's very general, it's okay. But for and I teach that to master students, but for PhD students, forget it.
What is the, I'm not sure I got the question. What is my
Question is
solution
that,
for what?
how can you use systems thinking for a PhD program?
Oh, you mean to do a PhD?
Yes. For example, do a dissertation and so forth. If the dissertation is showing the application of a Ackoff methodology in some company, you cannot publish that.
So the issue is that in the US, at any rate, the top journals like Operations Research Management Science won't take anything qualitative. It's got to be quantitative, and a lot of the kind of things we do are just screened out.
Right. I see what you're. Well, do both. I mean, use mixed methods. Use mixed methods. I mean, there's no reason to sort of say that you can use qualitative and quantitative methods together, which is a more systemic approach. Yeah.
I'm talking about systems thinking, and also it's very general, and you are looking at the whole thing compared to not system thinking that are you're specifically in one area.
Yeah, I don't agree with that characterization of systems thinking, generally speaking. I don't think of systems thinking as being sort of the study of the whole and not the parts. I think of systems thinking as no matter where you are in the system, you're going to be putting boundaries on it. And unless you're studying the entire universe or the metaverse or something, and that's your subject of study, then maybe that doesn't have any boundaries other than nothingness that came before the Big Bang. But other than that, you're causing framing to happen, and you're studying something that's been reduced in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I would add to that, it seems to me like the organization with you're dealing is never going to, if they're so fixed on the sector as organizations, rather than looking at the entire enterprise, then I can understand why they don't like systems thinking. But if one of the things you could do is say, well, let's look at this sector, but how does this sector interact with the other sectors? Then at least you get them to start broadening their thoughts about the understanding of what the interaction of the parts are, rather than just looking at the parts individually.
Can I answer the question as well? Couple of things to say about this. I have a different perspective than you probably because I don't live in the United States. It would be a lot harder in the States. In Europe, we can publish in journals like European Journal of Operational Research, which are considered top tier in Europe, but I don't know how they're considered in the US. We can get our systems work in there quite easily. They're actually very, very open to it. So that's the first thing to say pragmatically. But there's also a deeper issue of what counts in academia. If you're in an institution that defines your field so narrowly that it excludes you, then find another institution, because really that's got to end. And one of the good things we've got in the UK, which has really been useful for our group, is we have an impact agenda. So not only do we have to submit 4 publications every 5 years for evaluation in a national evaluation exercise, but each institution has to submit impact case studies. We had to submit 5 at the last exercise, and 3 of them were systems thinking applications. So 10% of the staff in our business school who were systems thinkers accounted for 60% of the impacts in that assessment, which gives us a role that is equally good to publication.
Johnny, you wanted to say something? Johnny, why don't you borrow a microphone?
Maybe get a mic.
He's got one.
I was just saying that it seems to me as well that if what you're doing does not comply with the tenets of scientific method, they have hard time publishing. The reviewers, they don't like it. And especially when your unit of whatever is, say, an organization or whatever, how can you do that? You cannot have experimentations, you know. At least this is the view here. And unfortunately, when you go to apply, you know, for tenureship and things like that, that's precisely what they're looking, the reputation
Yeah,
of the
no, I understand.
publication and who, you know, reviewers and all that. So it is a problem.
It's a problem. I guess I would say, you know, to answer this question, I would need a 6-pack of beer and we go talk about it at a bar for a long, long time. Because I think it's being, you know, there's a big system that you're talking about, and it's being framed in a lot of different ways that we would have to sort of parse out a little bit. My doctoral research was published in an A-level journal. The title of it was Systems Thinking. So one of the best journals in the country. So I just don't agree with that, that it's not possible. Is it hard? Yeah, it's hard to change the world, and you've got to fight. If you want to try to change the world, then you've got to fight hard. But I think if you do good research and you keep fighting the fight, you can get in journals. There's the Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They started as a little institute with just a few Nobel laureates that were trying to do something completely outside of the norm, completely outside of the box. I was trained there in my postdoctorate. It's one of the most amazing scientific places on Earth today. And it has completely influenced almost every scientific establishment in the United States since the 1980s. It has changed what they're doing because of this little institute that decided to do something different and to do it in a way that was scientific, but really pretty far out of the box. So I do think it's possible. I'm not, like I said, we need like, you know, a 6-pack or something to go through it. I'm not discrediting or discounting what you're saying as being systematically, you know, normative, I guess. But you can be in the tails, I guess. It's normative, but you have to work in the tails. And I think we can succeed in the tails if we hold ourselves accountable to a standard that to a high standard.
I just got a little note, all the questions from the audience should be written and then transmitted so we can get to them in a comprehensive way. Anybody else want to add any further on this? Okay, Scott, you had a lot of comments on question 3, which is what is your perspective on the complexity of our enterprises and the value of systems thinking to address complex challenges, and what are some examples? I thought you had some written stuff on there that might be interesting.
That was me, right?
Yeah. Did it sound right?
It doesn't sound like the one you said, though.
So lately, I've been thinking about my current employer, which is a great organization. It's called Geisinger. And Geisinger straddles healthcare, health insurance, and higher education. And I'm convinced that the interaction of those 3 industries will create healthier populations, healthier communities, and the trick is getting those 3 industries inside this single corporation to interact in a meaningful way that is not bound by the financial return that we're required to yield to do any one of those industries well. So it's this vicious, unintentional, with my optimist view, cycle of trying to find ways for things to work. Health care has a great industry opportunity inside of higher ed. You take the future citizens of our nation and you say, hey, can we find ways for you to be healthier? Can we, as Geisinger, interact with your student health centers? Can we interact with what you serve as your food and beverage, because every institution of higher education does? Can we think about where you live if you're on campus? Can we make those arenas better, healthier? But that's a difficult concept for a healthcare system because we're so bound worrying about Medicaid, Medicare, you know, treating those who are sick or in need. One of the things that I like about this and why I think the complexity is so real is Geisinger is one of those organizations that's looking at risk on both ends of delivering care. So we've got the insurance arm and we've got the healthcare arm. But I realized, and this is one of the reasons I came to study with Larry and Joel and others and, you know, finish what was started when I was with Johnny and Ackoff back at Penn, was that this is a really awful problem. And there are a lot smarter people at Geisinger than me, and I'm not prepared to take it on. But I'm convinced there is a systems thinking solution to help this work. So that's what I'm thinking about lately. And one thing I'll close with, we know that in healthcare we can't dictate better behaviors so that people become healthier. We tried that, doesn't work anymore. We know exclusively we can't create incentives, and we also know that we can't penalize people to become healthier. So I think the only answer is that education and shared outcomes. So that's what I'm thinking about on complexity of our systems. If anybody has an answer, write it down, give it to me. I'm finished with the dissertation, and I think Larry will wrap this up.
Anybody else want to add to this issue of the complexity of our enterprises?
So I'll say something about the nature of complexity, if you like. This is not my example. I think it came from Bob Flood originally, but he might have got it from somewhere else, I'm not sure. But if you think about the brain, a neurosurgeon will be very, very careful about how they put a scalpel into a brain. It's a highly complex organ, and you've got to be very careful with it. If you're a butcher, it's just a simple piece of meat and the cleaver can go straight through it. So complexity is not something where it's a matter of counting the parts and interactions. It's a matter of perspective as much as anything.
And that's from a vegan.
Yeah. Oh dear. So, I mean, the first thing I'd like to say is it's a matter of perspective. But the second thing is that I think it's useful to distinguish between when somebody wants a systems methodology and when they don't. So one of the examples I often give is in healthcare, and it triggered me thinking about this when you were talking about that. So if somebody wants to route ambulances through a city, then people are not going to mostly object to having ambulances. They probably think it's a good idea that the ambulances get to patients as fast as possible. So using some kind of optimization method is probably fine, and you can go to an OR person for that. But if you're dealing with something like drugs as a public health issue, then suddenly you've got polarization of stakeholder views. You've got people who believe in harm minimalization, you've got people who believe in legalization and regulation, you've got people who believe in complete prohibition, and these kind of perspectives come into conflict. And that's a whole different type of complexity when you've got multiple viewpoints. That's the kind of situation in which the kind of systems thinking I'm interested in can really engage, because there you really have to explore boundaries. You have to get involved in dialogue. You have to hopefully get people into an environment where they can open their thinking enough for emergent possibilities to come through.
You know, it's interesting on the complexity of organizations that it's almost beyond comprehension how fast things are changing and the impact that has on an organizational structure.
That's true.
And the notion that you have a way of doing things in an enterprise these days is almost incomprehensible. Because as soon as you think you got the structure within your going to work, I was just thinking in the automotive industry, all of a sudden they thought they had an agreement on what the mileage requirements were going to be.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the president comes in, no, I want you to get him lower than that. Who ever heard of lowering the mileage requirements? You know, well, I'm going to lower the price of the cars. Well, you know, that's not how you make decisions, you know, and so the whole complexity of the interaction of the enterprise with the society in which it exists, that's an entire level of complexity that we're not familiar with, I think, and the decision process somehow has to at least comprehend that difference.
So for me, when I think about complexity of systems, it's, and if I try to quantify that complexity, it is how cause and effect is separated in time and place. And so the greater the time delay, the more complex the system will feel, and the more difficult it'll be to make the right kinds of decisions. So if we tell our children to, you know, eat your broccoli steamed, because, you know, 50 years from now, your colon will like that. You know, the child's going to say, that's too long. And so in organizations and in social systems, when the cause and effect separation of time and place sometimes isn't even fully understood, understanding those interventions is critical, and being able to simulate and being able to stress test assumptions and look at the different future scenarios and the plausibility of these things. Those are really critically important thinking exercises. And one of the things that Vince just triggered in my mind, Vince brought Peter Drucker into General Motors in, I think it was the late 90s. And I had the distinct privilege of being Drucker's escort through the course of the day between the sessions that we had to his contractually arranged nap. And so we had this one single hour where we, you know, it wasn't nap time and it wasn't a meeting, and so three of us just sat in the room and talked about stuff. And I asked a question about, you know, how have you seen good innovation programs instituted in corporations? And he started yelling at me. And he says, you don't understand innovation. He says, General Motors innovated management theory. And then he said, do you know why you own a train company? And at the time, GM owned a subsidiary called Electromotive Division, and we built locomotives. And I thought, well, I guess at some point we must have thought about the future of transportation and being involved in all of the mobility patterns, and we built buses at the time, and so we probably wanted to be involved in trains. And he said, wrong. He said, the reason you own trains is because Boss Kettering, who was the original head of R&D, believed two things in his heart and soul. The one thing was that the only way to innovate with technology is to operate it in a commercially harsh environment. You would need to actually understand the economics of a technology. And the second thing that he believed in his heart and soul was that in the future of mobility, of propulsion, it was electric hybrid was going to be, electric diesel hybrids were going to be the future of propulsion. And he said, and the only way to learn about that technology in the economic harsh realities was to buy a train company. So he bought a train company. And so here, the cause and effect of kind of moving the needle on understanding a technology, which was going to have decades of time delay, was about making the right intervention for the system, not just of General Motors, but of society, because they believed it was the right thing to do. So I think helping through the education process of seeing cause and effect, separation of time and place, and multiple side effects that might be built into those things is critical for us.
Nick reminded me, Nick, when I first got to General Motors, I was given a tour of everything, and I was at the research labs, and I was walking through, and there was a door. It was about the size of this whole area. I said, what's that for? He said, that's where we used to bring the train in. And it wasn't until Drucker explained to me why. Okay, now, there were two questions that are kind of related. One was, remember Russ Ackoff's paper on the future of OR is in the past. Can you force yourself to imagine a case where the future of systems thinking is in the past? And the next question that someone else wrote was, is there a future state of systems thinking? Where is it, or could it go? So the question is, are we dealing with an issue here that's what OR was not that many years ago?
I'll take a stab at it. I guess it would depend which systems thinking you're talking about, the field of systems thinking, the discipline, or just the sort of phenomenon of systems thinking. I don't think the phenomenon of systems thinking is going to go out of style anytime soon, because the universe is made up of systems, and we think about them, and so that's probably going to continue for a long time. I think AI is nowhere near thinking like we do, despite all the reports and all that stuff. It can beat us at chess and things like that, but it's not. It can't make the mistakes and the biases that we make, which are the flip side of some of the creativity and innovation that we make. So our imperfections are in many ways of our brain are kind of part and parcel of what makes us special. So I don't think systems thinking as a phenomenon is going to go away. I think the field certainly needs to light a fire under itself and hold itself more accountable. All of us as researchers and people in the field, I think we need to, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and do more, be more evidentiary and more clear with our research.
I think it's not just being more clear, I think it's changing who we're having the conversations with. I think one of the things that really resonated to me was when Ackoff called systems thinking, I think he said, an introverted field. We tend to talk to ourselves more than to potential users. We don't seek out public understanding. It has become, as you were saying, Bill, somewhat exclusive in its implication. And I think that I would say that the future is not here yet, that once we try to do that, we might be in another state in a while. But I don't think that, having been on a very long journey with trying to sort of translate this and think about how to really teach kindergartners all the way to execs, and by the way, kindergartners are easier to teach systems thinking than execs usually, because they're more open-minded at that point in their life. I think we're not even close. I think we've got to really make a full-on effort towards public understanding, talking to people, potential users, applying it in anything that that it seems relevant to, which is, in my opinion, as to my lunch debate with Hercules, everything, he says, not all things, I say all things. We'll figure that out later. But I think we've got a lot of work to do still.
Yes.
I don't drink beer, but we'll figure something else out.
Maybe scotch and water, I don't know.
Yeah, that would be, I would do that. That'd be good.
Yeah, Gerald.
Yeah, so I mean, we started with early on talking about how children are natural systems thinkers. So in that sense, it's never going to go away. But we could shoot ourselves in the foot, and our community could go away pretty easily.
Yeah.
Very easy.
And then somebody would reinvent it with another label and another set of concepts. So I have to say that I feel a little bit culpable in this to an extent, given that I've been in this field for 30-odd years. And I came into the field in the late 80s with the mission for methodological pluralism, that these wars we were having at the time in the 80s between quantitative and qualitative, between systems science and systems design, between all these various divisions were so destructive. And I wanted to actually help shape this. So, I mean, it's one of the things that my group at Hull is really well known for, is promoting methodological pluralism. And we basically won that debate. And now people live and let live and let the various communities have their own concepts. So now, if you want to be faithful to that variety of systems approaches, it's actually very difficult to explain to somebody coming to it for the first time what it is, because the ideas of what systems thinking are quite different in the different paradigms. So I feel like I've been complicit, if you like, in getting us into a situation where we are that fragmented and in danger of not being able to explain to a policymaker what it is. So that's certainly one of my missions, and that's why one of the reasons why I'm working with Derek and Laura here to address that problem.
Yeah, I think Gerald's hitting on probably one of the most important things in the field, which is not moving away from methodological pluralism, but to have any kind of methodological pluralism, which just means, if people aren't familiar with that, it just means, being open to all the different frameworks, theories, approaches, having a big tent that lots of systems thinker types can be a part of. That's sort of methodological pluralism. But something has to cause you to belong to the tent, right? And that's called universality. And I think if I mentioned Santa Fe Institute earlier, part of the thing that set them apart was their deep, abiding desire, probably born of physics early on, was this sense that you could at least pursue universality. It's not easy to find universality, but you can pursue universality. And the pursuit of universality makes you better as a field. And if we look at the history of other fields, alchemy becomes chemistry when we get universal laws. Physics, metaphysics becomes physics when we get universal laws. Biology as an entire field was basically organismic stamp collecting by stuffing organisms into jars and putting them on shelves until Darwin came along and gave something universal to study across it, and it connected all of biology. So we need that methodological diversity, but we also need the universality. And there are many, many people in systems thinking and anthropology and lots of the social sciences, it's pretty pervasive, that just reject universality out of hand as even possible, which is an absurdity and one that you need many beers for. But so I think what Gerald's hitting on, this balance between pluralism and universality is the future of our field, and whether or not we attain it is the success of our field or the failure.
Scott?
I don't know how to follow that. That was good. I'd like to go back to one of Gerald's opening comments that maybe 10% of humans may be able to pick up on this complexity and tie that to the future of systems thinking. So I wonder if part of the future of systems thinking hasn't been around for a long time. And I say that because of your point. Yep. And because as a college student, not knowing what I was doing, I was reading Steady State Economics by Herman Daly. And it was very simple what Daly said. He said our production systems in which we value everything we do, manufacturing more cars, more whatever, are creating a waste product that exceeds our ability to absorb it within our natural systems. If we don't come up with some sort of steady-state economy, some balance, some structure, we will bring an end to what we do. That was very advanced systems thinking. As an undergraduate student at Muhlenberg, I had no idea what I was reading. And yet now everything I read comes back to that. And everything that I hear the faculty that I'm interacting with, the students that I get to be in class with, or the colleagues at Geisinger, reminds me that if we have a set of communities that are failing, if we have polluted rivers that run through them, if we have government structures and systems that can't keep pace, we've got problems. But yet systems thinking has been described by many for a long time, including some of the folks at this table. I think the future of systems thinking in some ways may be here, but as human beings, we either haven't yet aligned our value system or our urgency to make the change to subscribe to that future.
Anyone else? Okay.
Yeah.
This is an interesting one, which I think
For
is
me. Yours were
relative
cool.
to what we've been somewhat discussing, but somehow evading. How can we overcome the challenge that academic administration decision makers and faculty and the majority don't understand systems thinking and can resist application? First of all,
Sorry, you said don't
What was that
understand it.
question?
What was the last part?
don't understand systems thinking and can resist application.
And can resist application.
So how do we deal with that? Is that what the question is? How do we deal with it?
How do you overcome this challenge
Academic institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
of the academic administration decision makers?
Right.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
I think the problem is you'd have to change the paradigm of education writ large to move away from what it's steeped in, which is sort of linear thinking, bivalent logic, right and wrong, you can't make mistakes. We don't offer as much constructive feedback as we should probably, and like we were saying, focus on learning rather than grades. Because I think as an institution, it sort of works against itself. I think it's not a place that would really readily embrace the underlying tenets of systems thinking, which move away from the paradigm that we're in now. But I don't know. I mean, you probably have thoughts on this.
No, it's interesting because the cost of education in California is just incredibly large, and the biggest increase is in administration and structure,
Sure.
and not in teaching issues. And
Yep.
and when you go to these campuses and you see what an establishment it has become, you wonder what else is going on. Maybe they're actually teaching there too.
Right.
And so I think there is an issue of the educational system is
Yeah.
become a bureaucracy of its own,
Yeah,
and it's in a position where it actually controls things quite well.
yeah,
And to get change is not going to be easy, would be my guess.
yep.
you gonna lean in there?
Sure. Are you?
You go.
you-
I'm ready. You go.
I mean, I think it's a question that, certainly one that we have to think about. I guess I don't really spend a lot of time thinking of it, because I don't think it's a question that's going to put you in a position to really make change. It's going to put you in a position to feel
Right.
powerless
Yeah.
to make change. And that's going to take away from the influence that you have. So, I mean, Galileo had some pretty stiff competition. Einstein was a patent clerk. He didn't have a whole lot of power. Darwin, was absolutely terrified prior to publishing Origin of Species. Jane Goodall was pretty much ignored. Gandhi, I mean, you name it, people who have changed the system just worked at doing what they did incredibly well until it was incontrovertible. And yeah, the odds are against you, but they're going to just be more against you if you don't do your job well and you spend all the time worrying about what administrators, how stupid they are or how ignorant they are. they've probably been that way for generations, you know, or thousands of years, and it's probably not going to change. But
They were trained
the quality
properly.
of your work is going to change that system.
Yeah.
And I think as systems thinkers, we need to focus on that instead of who's not listening, focus on our work and who's listening.
You know, it's interesting too, because the way technology is changing. I mean, there was a time, if you ever wanted to publish something, it had to be through
Right.
all the academic.
Right.
Now you go to Amazon, you type it
Totally.
in, you got a book.
Yeah.
And if it's a good book and you communicate properly,
You can get it out there.
you're educating
Yeah,
people to alternatives.
I agree.
Yes, go ahead.
So I've been one of those administrators in
Oh.
in the industry of higher education. And I guess where I would start is, you know, there's a fundamental problem with the scorecard. You know, we've got the wrong scoreboard. Higher education globally is a $1.9 trillion industry in 2017 dollars. We have created a machine in the United States that's a $650 billion industry in the U.S. So we are fine-tuned, we are training these administrators, of which, yes, I'm still one, every year to build and further this vicious cycle. So I think there's a fundamental shift, and I think you started to say it, which is we simply have to change the scoreboard. If we don't measure things differently than we're measuring now,
Yes.
we will soon create one of the largest, most exclusive industries in human history that will be inaccessible or too costly for most.
Yep.
So I think this is an invitation for all systems thinkers, all of us in the room connected with institutions of higher education in any form, to take this challenge on, to interact with it fast.
Yep.
Because it's a problem. It's a real problem.
Can I add
Yes,
something?
Gerald.
So what I was mulling over in my mind when I was hearing the question is that I'm in an unusual institution in that systems thinking has a critical mass at the University of Hull. It's one of only 2 universities in the UK where it does have a critical mass. And I was thinking, well, what made the difference? What enabled us to get out of that situation where systems thinking is so marginalised? We're far from marginalised. We're one of the strongest research groups in our business school. We generate as one of the top revenues in terms of research income. We have some of the top publications. So how is it that we manage that? And if I'm honest about it, the answer was entrepreneurship within education. So back in 1988, Bob Flood moved to Hull and joined Mike Jackson, and together they set up the first distance education, distance teaching programs in the world. So distance learning had been around for decades, but they flew faculty around, and within a year or two we had about 5,000 MBA students in 5 or 6 different countries around the world, and the profits from that basically set up our Centre for Systems Studies. So within a couple more years, we had a whole team of systems researchers, and then we can start to do our own programs. We have a PhD program that has about 40 students on it each year. But it was entrepreneurship within that system that started it.
Anything else? That's an interesting question. It says, speaking of trains, will the U.S. be able to recover from cars and revert to European public transportation? I think I was asked that question one day.
You drove 3 hours from Gettysburg to Philadelphia on a train, it would take an hour.
Yeah.
But you had to go to Pennsylvania to get to Harrisburg to get a nightmare.
I don't know. Anything's possible, but Americans like their cars.
True.
And their dogs and their guns.
All those good things, yes.
Well, so there was a book that was written, I think, in the 1980s by a UK writer, John Wormall, and the book was called Driving Over a Cliff. And he was talking about the auto industry, and he said that vehicles have 5 sins that they contribute to society. One is death, safety, mortality, morbidity. It's getting worse on a per mile driven basis. Second is environmental impact getting worse. Third is emissions, sort of the noxious toxins are getting worse. Fourth is congestion and impact on productivity, and it's getting worse. And fifth is the economic dislocation. They are very expensive and getting more expensive, and it's a necessity in life, and it's just a big chunk of your income. And he said, even though these things are getting worse, the one thing that it does provide is personal freedom, and that's not going away, and therefore people are willing to spend a significant amount of money, borrow a lot of money, to acquire an asset that sits idle 95% of the time so that they have personal freedom when they want it. I always take issue with that 95% of the time sits idle. It's not sitting idle. It is sitting at the ready for me. And so this notion of personal freedom is one of the things that we have to keep in mind as a systemic objective if we were to actually build a public transportation system. Because when I think about for my life in a lot of the situations that I find myself in, vehicles are selfishly more effective for me. And I'd rather not use public transportation. But when I travel to some cities like Boston, I don't drive a car. And so it's a bigger system than just the transportation itself.
And they're super bad in an Ebola endemic. Like, if you have ever just public transportation, you're going to get higher spread.
If you're a germaphobe.
Yeah, I'm a germaphobe. So I'm pretty much against being around people. I'm totally kidding. Sharing too much. What? Well, we might. I mean, you know, the evolution.
You know, the other issue is the manner in which our population is dispersed in our country is quite a bit different than it is in Europe.
Yeah.
And things like the suburbs make public transportation a little bit more difficult as far as the ability to move around. Although cities like Boston and New York, where you have it a little bit better structured, it works out reasonably well. But I think that's probably one of the reasons is the diversity. I know since I've retired, we live in a very small community. I have my car is nearly 5 years old, and it's got 10,000 miles on it. But those 10,000 miles are really important ones to us because it takes us to the store and to the movies
Right.
and stuff like where the public transportation couldn't do it. So that's one of the things you have to take into consideration, I think. Okay. Good questions here. It says, how do you get leaders to accept third-generation design by users rather than leaders? I'm not sure I understand. Who asked that question? You did?
Nope, not me, but I understand it.
Okay. Why don't you explain it to us?
Well, it's the whole movement towards customer-centric design, and the design thinking of the Stanford School is spreading like wildfire, especially to the platform companies like Google and Facebook and so
Yes.
on. And that's a key word, user-centric design.
And the question is, how do you get leaders to adopt it?
I don't know the question that well.
No, it says design to accept the design by users rather than leaders.
How do you get who to accept it? The administrators or the
No,
leaders?
the users
The
to
leaders.
accept it.
The
Users.
leaders.
How do you get the users to
Yeah,
accept
that's good,
user-centered design?
Third-generation design. What's that?
Who asked the question?
That's why I asked. I didn't get an answer.
It's somebody. Well, I mean, my experience is that, like you said, it's like wildfire. You don't have to convince most organizations that they need to
User.
adopt design thinking or agile or systems thinking, loop thinking, design processes.
Yep. That user feedback is more valuable than anything else
For
in the
sure,
design process.
yeah. The hardest thing is helping them. We need more tools. You know, we're essentially in the process corporationally of moving the entire edifice of research methods out of science and into the corporation.
Yeah.
And there's not enough skill in utilizing all those methodologies in order to get information from users and to understand the users, and, you know, things as simple as coding textual analysis and things like that, people aren't familiar with, or they don't have the tools to do, and they're trying to understand the user. So I think it's more like there needs to be better tools that are user-friendly, better UXs and stuff like that.
Yep.
This question is, again, related, but it's more specific. It says, can systems thinking help address our big problems, cost of education, healthcare, et cetera? If yes, why are we not seeing it being tried or applied? But first of all, I think in some cases it is being tried and applied. But I wouldn't say universally. And what might be the cause of it not being generally applied or used as one would expect, given its benefits?
I mean, one of the, I'm hesitant to answer this because I'm going to give the answer to the last question that you've got on there, which is about how do you explain systems thinking to make it understandable to people. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. So,
we know not to stop you, Gerald.
Right. So, it is being applied, and there are thousands of applications. Now, I hate to go to conferences where you hear people moaning about the lack of applications, because it's simply not true. There are just thousands and thousands of applications written up. We're just not doing enough with them. So that's the first thing to say. But it is true that it's difficult to convince a policymaker to take on systems thinking in a 2-minute elevator pitch. And we have to actually understand why that is such a difficult challenge. So first of all, I want to say that I want to take on 2 challenges. The first is how to explain it in 2 minutes. The second one is how not to reduce systems thinking to one methodology. Because it's a lot easier if you just say, I'll explain system dynamics, or I'll explain soft systems methodology, or whatever. And that's doing nobody any favors, because then you're setting them up for having then conflicts with other people down the track with different ideas. So why is it so difficult? Well, there's a couple of linguists and philosophers, Sperber and Wilson, who talk about relevance theory, and they give a simple formula for why an idea is or isn't relevant to somebody. So somebody hears about systems thinking for the first time, and the relevance of that idea to them is a function of 2 things. It's the number of cognitive inferences that a person can get from that idea, and that's minus the amount of work it's going to take for them to assimilate that idea. Now, what is the first thing that people hear? The first thing they hear is that there's this wonderful idea, and they have no idea if it's going to give them a lot of cognitive inferences. We know that it will, because we know that systems are ubiquitous, and that the concepts that you can abstract from it are so useful for thinking about all sorts of different things. They don't, because they haven't experienced it. They have, if only they knew it, you know, if not in childhood, anything else, but in terms of conceptualizing it, they haven't. So they're skeptical. But one thing that they do know is that there's a huge load of methodologies out there, and learning those is a pile of work. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that we're not getting through. So we really do need that lean description of what systems thinking is. I mean, I don't tend to use the word universals, you do, but but for me it's a lean description that simply talks very simply about systems thinking skills, and from there you can open up into the universe of systems methodologies. And the first thing is to grab people's interest with that lean narrative. Second thing is to give them an experience, because once people have done it, then that's a whole different thing to them hearing about it. And the third thing then is opening up into those different approaches. and really beginning then to work with organizations and improve things.
You know, it's interesting, you just reminded me, when I was bringing forth the concept of systems thinking at GM, there was, as you can only imagine, one or two questions being raised. At that time, we had like 6 divisions, each of whom were doing, they thought, reasonably well, while the corporation was not. And in making the presentation, I was asked, well, why should we do this? You know, those guys are working very hard, doing their jobs. We didn't have women doing things in those days. And I said, so what is our reward system in the corporation? He said, what do you mean? How do people get rewarded? Well, it depends on how well they're doing their job. I said, how come our profits are not high if everybody's doing their job so well? And there was silence. I said, perhaps the people should get rewarded based on how well the corporation's doing.
Yeah.
And at that point, we broke the groundwork. We didn't get it all accepted, but at least they started thinking differently.
Right.
And I think that's one of the issues that needs to be addressed is the reward structure in a lot of places is based on how well you do your job, not how well your job contributes to the benefit of the enterprise. Yeah. And you can't determine that unless you have a system in place that actually can measure that.
I was going to add an example I use. Yeah, I think of medical systems, medical professionals, I think we all benefit from their ability to look at things as a system because they have solutions that are counterintuitive. And an example I use is some 30 years ago, I had my colon removed as a prevention for colon cancer. It was a 2-hour procedure at the Leahy Clinic. And in fact, my wife said it was shorter than that between the time she kissed me goodbye and the surgeon came out. And both of our kids inherited the same thing, so about 6, 7 years ago, they each had their colons removed. But it was 2 procedures. One was 12 hours long, followed several months later by a 6-hour procedure. So I say to people, how is 12 hours plus a few months later, 6 hours, better than 2 hours? But the insurance companies pay for this because it's faster recovery using laparoscopy. But if all you do is look at those hours, you'd say, that makes no sense. But somebody has convinced the insurance companies that it makes sense. And it's $10,000 a day at UCLA Medical Center. So the idea is, these solutions are out there, but if all you do is look at time and surgery, you'd say, that's crazy. No, the system, so what I think is cool is the professionals in the trenches have figured this stuff out. The way organizations operate is not. And the other example I use is in 1904, so when I studied in graduate school, Ludwig Prandtl discovered boundary layers. Boundary layers are the things that separate. Well, what boundary layers are is the idea that the wing flying through the air, the velocity of the air at the surface is 0. I mean, the airplane doesn't slide through the air, it's actually sticking to the air. And the boundary layer is that thin region over which the velocity goes from 0 to infinity. Or I'm sorry, whatever it is in the free stream. Anyway, he discovered this, and within a year, golf balls had dimples. And if you look at the dynamics of drag on a golf ball, there's 2 modes of drag. There's pressure drag, which you decrease by making the golf ball smaller. Just like as a bicyclist, when you bend down, you're lowering the pressure drag. And there's also frictional drag. So if you wear something slippery, that's reducing frictional drag. Well, what dimples do is increase the frictional drag. So what's interesting is, by increasing the frictional drag, they have reduced the form drag. If you allowed an organization to reduce the drag on a golf ball, you'd have one team going off coming up with a slipperier golf ball to reduce frictional drag, and the other one making it smaller. The whole idea that you make one large to make the other small is what engineers and scientists can figure out, but that's not how organizations work. So these solutions systemically are in our products around us, but they are not in the thinking of those who run the organizations.
Yes, Gerald.
I can add another healthcare example to this, and it's about simplistic measures. And as long as simplistic measures are being used, there's no incentive to think systemically about some of these issues. So a hospital that I've had some contact with, they were doing gastroscopies where they put the camera down the throat, and they're celebrated as being the best in the country because they can do the fastest throughput of patients. And the reason that they can do patients in a third of the time of a lot of other units is they don't give them any anesthetic. So the patients pay in pain and discomfort for the price of actually the higher throughput. Now, they're being told that they're the best in the country, and yet their side effect is so obviously wrong. Using simplistic measures like that is not at all helpful.
Another one we have here is, my organization, we often get stakeholders together and discuss the problem and systems, but get stuck in identifying a solution or action plan. How do we overcome this decision paralysis? I guess my comment would be you haven't discussed systems properly.
Yeah.
Because if you understand it's a problem is related to the interactions of the organization, then that should start the discussion of how do we fix the interactions. So if, I guess I would say maybe a discussion, what do you mean by systems thinking, might be appropriate, and examples of how it actually works to address that issue. Let's just add to that if you would.
Yeah, I guess I would say I don't typically, we try to get our students out of the habit of constantly taking a problem-solving approach. Most of the time that problem-solving comes with a ton of biases that you load onto the system. So we mostly try to get them to understand the system, and when you deeply understand why the system's behaving the way it is, you know, just that understanding of this system behaves this way because of the way that it's structured and the way that the agents are incentivized or whatever, that sort of tells, and if I want that system to behave differently, then I need to do this, and if I want it to keep behaving that way, then I need to do this, and it's more like, I mean, imagine if like you're trying to get your kids to do something, they're like little systems, right? And everything you framed as like a problem, like your kid's always a problem. Your kid's not a problem, they're just a kid, and like there's ways to work with them that get them to do what they want, what you want them to do, and there's ways to work with them that get them to do the opposite of what you want them to do. And if you constantly were like, I need to fix this problem that is my child, then I think that just puts a lot of bias on that system.
And I would add, one of the things that I know we do is once we've sort of gotten our students away from problem solving to understanding the system, then, I mean, the reality is most of them are going to be working in teams. And when they go back to, when they're done with grad school and they're going back to their host countries or the governmental organizations that are sponsoring them. And so then the thing we would say next is, well, let's really interrogate that understanding and build a shared mental model, you know, among all of the stakeholders in the group so that it's not understanding as a static picture, but challenging that understanding, getting all of the different perspectives on the boundaries, on the relationships, or all the relationships accounted for, all of the different perspectives that could give us insight accounted for. Are we seeing it differently from one perspective that's more salient than the other? And I think that process of purposefully interrogating your understanding of something moves you from that paralysis of a decision and actually engages the stakeholders and makes a more viable understanding and therefore a more viable approach that might not be solving the problem, but maybe bettering a condition, or, you know, we don't always have a solution, but we can change the conditions that are affecting people in a negative way and turn them around.
So I've got a few things to say about this one as well, because I actually think that's one of the great things about idealized design as an approach. I've rarely had problems actually getting people thinking in an ideal mode, people are really enthusiastic about doing that. And it's quite different from just simply exploring a mess and then saying, what do we do next? If you do that, people just get really stuck. But I mean, I know, for example, using soft systems methodology, I mean, my experience of doing that is slightly different. So there is actually quite a gap between doing a rich picture where you've got this rich diagram of all the mess, and actually starting to identify systemic ways forward that you could work with that. And often you get people stuck at that point in a kind of yes, but. So somebody will suggest an idea, yes, but it won't work because, yes, but it won't work because. And there are facilitation techniques you can use actually to get people over that. So once 5 people have said yes, but, you can say, well, maybe there isn't a way forward in this situation after all. And because they're stuck in a pattern of yes, but, they have to say yes, but, and suggest an idea. I've used it several times, and it really does work.
It's, you know, when after a while, what I used to do, if we were going to start a meeting to talk about this, I would say, this is the beginning of a discussion. We will not come up with a solution today. And the first thing we're going to identify is who's involved in this decision and what do we assume about them. And everybody would say, well, that's going to take some time. I said, good decisions usually do. Yeah. And so I think if you bring people together and say, okay, here's systems thinking, here's how we're going to do it, and they've had no experience with it, you can't really blame them for not coming up with any kind of a solution.
I think that becomes really important too with the advent of agile or design thinking, where you're going around the systems thinking loop and testing your mental models against reality constantly. Is that, you know, your decisions aren't like you're not going to sit kind of waterfall style in a room for 6 months to come up with a decision. You're going to make little mini decisions, test them, and then get feedback, and then make more mini decisions. And I think that's a more evolutionary strategy than kind of a waterfall process.
It was interesting, another question just came up. It says, can you increase systems thinking by formulating the problem of interest at the next higher level? And in fact, that should be what the next, what should be the current discussion should be, is what is the problem, besides the one we think we're working on. And it's by engaging people and identifying stakeholders and things of that nature that you address the higher level issue, which has to be understood if you're going to solve the lower level issue.
A lot of times, though, when we get into this problem thinking, it causes the person to miss things like POSIWID, the purpose of a system is what it does, because they don't see that, like, you know, if you have a system where sales isn't high, right, or you're not getting enough customers or something like that, I think it's really important to understand that that system is really well designed at not getting customers, right? It's like a really good system for not getting customers. And I think if you're like, the problem is it's not getting customers, you kind of miss the whole point, which is, no, the problem is it's really good at not getting customers. It's been designed to not get customers, right? That problem paradigm can actually kind of get you into a cul-de-sac of thinking that's hard to get out of.
When we were doing all the interventions at General Motors, one of the things that Vince brought to the company was a decision discipline, born out of the Stanford decision risk analysis arena, but in a structured way, and we called it dialogue decision process, and it was bringing the decision makers, the resource allocation, the people who own the resources, and their trusted lieutenants to work on a problem. And part of the framing of the problem was to understand all the dimensions. And when we asked the next step, once we framed the problem, the next step was, what are the alternative solutions? And there was sort of 3 steps to this thing. One was, and we called it like drilling test wells in oil exploration. We're not going to pick any of these test wells. We're going to actually learn from the test wells, and we're going to build a hybrid solution that actually makes sense, that takes into consideration everybody's input. And the very first step of the process is to identify what's the momentum decision. If we didn't do this intervention, what would the organization just do by default? Or what would we do? What is our momentum play? And momentum, I found over the years, had three profound values. The first value was most of the organization across the different silos and across the different functions, they didn't know what momentum was. And so just laying it out, people learned a lot about the functions and dysfunctions of the company. The second value was because we could place some numerical quantification around momentum, it made analyzing the alternatives that come later easier from a delta standpoint. And the third huge value was at the end of this process, the final solution, this hybrid solution, becomes so intuitively in your head that people would say, yeah, we were going to do this anyway. You know, this is what we were planning on doing anyway. And you say, well, no, actually momentum was what we were planning on doing, and the difference in value is the value of this exercise and the systemic thinking process that we just went through. So I shared this once with a very senior executive at another company, and he said, so our process was you frame the problem, then you generate alternative solutions, and then you do a lot of analysis, and then you connect all these insights and come up with this hybrid solution. And he said, it's a nice process, but you're doing two of the steps wrong. You should do the analysis first so that you can properly constrain what alternatives you consider, because you're wasting a lot of time. And I said, well, actually, people know in advance what the right solution should be from their organizational perspective, and unless they have an opportunity to espouse that solution and it is the right solution, they're not going to want to participate. And because they have a chance to articulate their insights, their perspectives, and then learn through the process of how they've contributed, and actually so has this other group contributed, and we can find a systemic solution that will work for the company to move towards our objectives, that's the right way to go. He sat back and he says, wow, I wasted a lot of years.
It was interesting, too, because one of the other groups that we would establish was a way out group, somebody who was going to come up with an idea that nobody would accept. And their job was to make, if it was easily understood and accepted, they didn't do a very good job. And it was very interesting to me once in a while, one of the ideas in there, somebody would say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's a real possibility. And so having these alternative views, then you had to list what you had to believe about the critical assumptions about the stakeholders for each of those four alternatives. And then you would look at that and say, oh, there's the problem. You know, if we don't get that person to change his mind, that's not going to happen. And so that was the dialogue that took place, and it usually ended up with a hybrid solution that took the best of all of them. And I remember one time we were having a meeting, and somebody said, well, when we make these assumptions on this way out one, and you're a stakeholder, do we have to say what we think you would do under this crazy idea? I said, yes. I said, it will not affect your career.
So one last comment, sorry, Gerald. This was a structure that we brought, but the tools, the specific tools that we used to do the framing, to do the analysis, to do the assessment, it included systems thinking tools, it included other quantitative methodologies, it included whatever was necessary from the toolbox. And we were kind of journeymen and who had a bunch of tools to apply to problems. And in some problems, systems thinking tools were the only way through this process.
Yeah, I was thinking we shouldn't actually neglect the innovations that we have here in some of these systemic dialogue approaches compared with traditional social science. I started out in a traditional social science institute, and I was doing projects where it was 90% analysis of the problem, and then the 10% at the end was you sitting down and thinking about what the recommendations to the decision makers should be. And of course, they were never acted on. And after a couple of instances of this, I talked to one of my colleagues about it and said, I'm really not very happy about this. We're getting money to do these projects and nobody's actually using it. And she just said, well, that's just how it is. Only about 1 in 10 ever gets implemented. Yeah. I just thought there has to be a better way. And I was quite lucky I found systems thinking, because it's almost the other way around. For me, it's 10% problem exploration and 90% working collaboratively on solutions.
Yes. Okay, I think we're running out of time, and there was one interesting question which I'm not sure who it should be directed at, whether it's to this table or to everybody in the room. It says, why did you attend this event? And what do or did you hope to gain or learn. So if anybody wants to, from the audience, participate in this, just raise your hand and make sure you get the microphone. But
I
why don't
have
you
a
start?
very selfish reason I was excited to be here because of all the people that have worked with Russ over the years. We had the good fortune of Russ working with us at General Motors for about a 10-year period, Russ?
Yeah,
Vince?
yeah.
And he would train a lot of our staff, and he would train a lot of people in the company. He would work a lot of problems, and he conducted seminars, and he taught people idealized design. And I had the privilege, the honor of sitting through his idealized design lectures probably a couple of dozen times, and I've heard him tell the AT&T Bell Lab story, which for me is probably the most profound thing of all time. And so I've heard the story many times, and many years into this process, Russ says to me at the end of one of the classes, he says, "Nick, how many times have you heard me tell the AT&T story?" And I said, "I don't know, a lot." He goes, "You are very arrogant." And I was shaken. I didn't understand. I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "For somebody who has heard this story so many times, there is a question that you should have asked me a long time ago. And the fact that you have never asked me this question implies that you are very arrogant." And I was dumbfounded. I said, I don't know what that is. He says, "You've always heard me say that during that process in the 1950s, we created every single innovation that has been implemented in telephony." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Why have you not asked me what has not yet been implemented that we developed?" And I was blown away by that question. And I said, that's a fantastic question. Were there some things? And he said, there were many things that have not yet been implemented. I said, "Are you going to share them?" He said, "I'll share one with you." And he told me one, and then I never heard any more after that. He passed away. And so my very selfish desire is, if you've had this conversation with Russ, I want to hear about the other things that they invented in 1950 that have not yet been implemented, because I want my mind blown again. Okay, I'll tell you the one. He said one of the things that, he said we came up with caller ID. We came up with call waiting. We came up with voice messaging systems. We came up with a whole bunch of different components. He says, and the one thing we were really concerned about was the social dynamics that are created by you being interrupted by another call and having to be rude to the person that's on the phone. He said, so what we designed was a process that would do, you could program some rules that would reside in your phone that would either automatically handle the call for you, or show you who's calling and give you a choice of 3 buttons to press to execute a certain rule that you've designed. And one of the rules might be, just immediately send it to voicemail, doesn't matter. Or another one might be, hey, I'm on another call, I'll call you back in a little bit. Or a third one is just like drop it completely because I don't want to talk to that person. So whatever the rules are that you set, he said he wanted people to have an elegant, socially acceptable solution. And so, and these functionalities now exist, but not in the way that he had conceived of it fully, he says, because the technology is kind of coming together. So that was the one that he shared with me, and then I never heard any more, but he said there was more. So tonight, over several beers, let's talk about those ideas.
Okay, any other comments from the dais? Preference and why you came?
I
Participate?
heard there were sandwiches. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, you know, it was Russ was a legend, so, you know, honoring his work and honoring his legacy was kind of an obvious choice.
Yes.
When invited.
I know exactly how you feel. Scott?
Yeah, so I am much luckier than I realized, having had a lot of exposure to Russ over the better part of about 20 years. Russ, Johnny, we did a lot of stuff. We worked with a lot of corporations, and I was in a particular leadership position at a small liberal arts college, and I was very excited to tell Russ about it, and it was a goal to find myself in the job I was in, and I was there, you know, just a couple of months, and then Russ died. And you know, I'm a student of his, you know, love the industry of higher education, the good and the bad of it. but selfishly wanting to be with all of you and Larry and Johnny and Joel and others is to continue that learning. And you know, I know that's sort of a somber note, but it's energizing to hear these stories, to see folks committed to work on this great stuff, to read these wild books, to meet the folks that I'll be studying and reading with. And, you know, that's sort of what it's all about. Just keep doing meaningful stuff.
Laura, you want to add anything?
I mean, I would just add, I mean, I've not been fortunate enough to have ever actually interacted other than reading things that were written, and we teach our students about some of the fundamental things that he's written about. But I guess for me, a lot of the bigger ideas to me that he's written about still hold true. And I think when we have conversations about the future of systems thinking as a field, as a whatever, however you want to characterize it, there are things we can still look back on that apply and can help guide that discussion. And I think that's an important discussion. I think, you know, the idea of purposefully pushing this work forward to bigger audiences, public understanding, to me is really, I mean, I think that's what Derek and I always think about. And I think that he would have been a big advocate of that as well. So this was a unique opportunity for us in that sense.
Joe?
Yeah, so we have a Centre for System Studies in Hull that was opened in 1992, and Russ Ackoff actually opened that centre, and he was a good friend, really, of our centre right through its years until his death. So he would visit us every couple of years. He never charged us for the work that he did with us. He gave us high-profile lectures. We gave him an honorary doctorate. So it was a really good collegial relationship. But in terms of why I accepted this, it was partly to honor Russ, but it was also to meet this community, because I'm not an insider to this community. I haven't been part of this community before. And you always learn a lot when you go into a new community. So.
Bill, you want to make any comments?
I'd just say, it's kind of like Nick, you know, over the 5 or so years I knew Russ, I heard a lot of stories, but there's a lot of stories I didn't hear. And relative to the phone, he said, he said, you know, Bill says, the only thing this phone, he said, there's only one thing that this phone has that they didn't think of back in 1955. You know what that was?
Well, he's told me two.
Okay.
Cameras?
Yes.
Yeah, and internet.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, and no, I was, anyway, it's a fun community to be with.
If anybody in the audience wants to raise comments or indicate why you came and whether you thought it was worthwhile, there's my microphone. There's a gentleman back there.
Hi, I never actually met Russell Ackoff. I did read a lot, and community and interactions are two reasons that brought me here. Thank you.
There's a question over here.
Hold on a second. Just
There
one
he
second,
comes.
one
He's
second.
coming around right now.
I remember the idealized design story in Russ's OR 601 class, which I admit was over 50 years ago. And to my amazement, Russ said they had identified many, many properties of the ideal design for the telephone system. And one of them was that the receiver of the call preferred to have the call come to him or her personally rather than to have it go to a desk or an office or a location. And Russ just said that in passing. Now, my best client over many, many years has been the Motorola Corporation. And they had all the technology necessary to create the cell phone, but not the idea. AT&T had the idea in the idealized design process and could have literally put together a cell phone with their enormous, the Bell Labs capabilities. Probably would have taken them a week. I actually had a friend that built a cell phone himself, just using a Motorola radio and a couple of other devices. He was an MIT guy, but he built a cell phone, and I can remember, and this is 20 years before Motorola came out with the first cell phone, and I remember he called his home from the top of a mountain in New Hampshire that we had just walked up. And I just can't understand why the organization like AT&T, the cell phone destroyed AT&T, among other things, and I can't understand why they didn't act on that insight. Russ just passed it off as another item in the story, and that was back in 1965. The cell phone didn't come along for another 30 or 40 years.
Yes.
Any idea?
I have no idea. So, yes.
The push buttons, that was the main thing that came out of that story, and I have the audio tape of that story. I imagine it's been duplicated somewhere, but I have the audio tape. I used to show it to my students. But it was his head in black and white talking to some CEOs, so my undergraduates just... But when he got to the part about the whole idealized design, is the engineers came in the room, they asked some questions, and they disappeared without saying hello, goodbye. He said that's typical, you know, for them. And then they came back, and he said, those push buttons, they're wonderful because they save 6 seconds for every thing, and that was the big outcome of it. And I still remember him saying that. I went up on a mountain, and I had the phone, it came with me, and blah, blah.
I'm sorry, 10% of all the switching capacity of the Bell system was devoted to misdialed numbers, wrong numbers. And they also discovered that the reason that they were having so much trouble was that people would put their finger into the rotary phone prior to its completing its revolution. And that would cause it to be off by 1 or 2 little clicks. The engineer that developed the idealized design invented and patented the 10, you know, the keyboard that's standard now, the 10 number, what do you call it, 10-digit keyboard. You know, the 3 rows or 4 rows. And Russ said it was absolutely amazing when the engineer heard this fact that the rotary phone, which they were so proud of, was the cause of a complete and total uselessness, non-value add of 10% of the switching capacity. He went out of the room, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, he came in with a prototype of the Princess phone, which solved the problem completely. And that was a major accomplishment.
Johnny, you got...
Just for your information, the best quality video of Ackoff's talk on Bell Lab is available, and you can. It's a Vimeo video, and if you Google, you can get it. And I think everybody is using it to get their idealized design sessions going.
This gentleman had a question, I think, next.
To answer the question about why I came here, I was part of the Social System Sciences program between 78 and 82 plus, because we kept going back and forth to finish the PhD. And that was a very innovative learning institution. It was a learning organization, which was very productive. It transformed my life, and I've been feeding off that for the last 30-some years. And when I heard that Larry is going to set up an institute with Ackoff's name on it, I couldn't resist the temptation of recreating something even more, well, creating something even more innovative than the social system sciences program. Of course, this in addition to honoring Russ, meeting friends, and being part of the community, and that's the reason why I'm here.
I came here, I think, in the same way I met Ross Ackoff. I just finished my PhD in Operations Research from Berkeley. I audited a class of Churchman, and all my mathematical programming and everything, I say, this is something I want to go. So I returned to Mexico, start working a little bit in this area, and I knew that he was coming to Mexico for his sabbatical. And I said, I have to work with him. So I went with the head of the Institute of Engineering in the National University of Mexico, and I told him, Dr. Rosenbluth, I want to work with Russell Ackoff. He looked at me and said, no way, only the Institute of Engineering. I was in systems and mathematics. Nothing. So I started looking, and I knew that he was going to go in a project in the government with CONASUP. And I say, who do I know about good? I find the guy, I invite him to eat, and I say, you are in CONASUP. I know that Ackoff is coming to this place for a project. I want to participate in that. He said, impossible. This is highly confidential. They say, no way. They say, but you know what is the approach of Ackoff? He said, no. I have these notes that is the one that I teach in my class. So he took it. When they start the project in the government, Ackoff told the big boss, Solana, Mr. Solana, it's great, we are going to start this project, and I'm going to bring 2 people from the university to work here. He told him, it's highly confidential. You know what Ackoff say? Excuse me? This is the way I work. I'm going to bring 2 people from the university. My friend say, Mr. Ackoff, could this be one of the ones I told you about with these notes? Yes. Next day, I got a call from the Office of Engineering. He said, Mr. Ackoff wants to talk to you. Do you have time? Of course. So 1 year together, working with Ackoff day and night, I became his TA in his class. And the first thing was saying is, what in the hell is he doing that he gets in front of a problem and he immediately knows what's the problem? But I found that his secret were in his books already. So after 1 year, I could approach 80% of the same solutions, but 20 was the genius of it. So since then, for 30 years, we have become very good friends. So I couldn't miss this place.
Okay.
I learned systems theory in the late 60s. Okay, I learned systems theory in the late 60s, early 70s, COTS and CON, and program planning, budget system, things like that. And Russ was coming to Villanova in 1998 to teach a class to the faculty in systems theory, and I took it for the simple reason to refresh my memory, because I'm in finance, and systems thinking is not, well, let's just say it's not really there in finance. We're more mechanistic. And we are getting into a kind of physics, the junction of economics and physics with the Santa Fe Institute. But when you're kind of off by yourself, you just need to come back and refresh and hear the thinking again. And that was the reason I'm here. In terms of AT&T, being in finance, I think a lot of the issue there, why Russ's innovations weren't implemented, was because it was a monopoly. There was no incentive to bring that stuff out. And it really wasn't until AT&T was broken up that you saw call waiting and caller ID and you name everything else that went with it. Western Electric really didn't want to, other than the Princess phone, Western Electric had no incentive. So I really believe that the monopoly that AT&T had held back the advancement of the phone.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. Well, I met Ross through Raul Carvajal when he was there, and I was he was giving a seminar once a week, and Raul invited me to be there. I was there. I learned. Actually, I fell in love with those ideas, those systemic ideas that I didn't know. And after a while, I came to Philly, studied the same as O's. I don't see O's anymore. So we were contemporary with him. And I keep on doing systems and trying to apply all those things I learned from him and the other guys. Now, why I am here? First, the fact that this was going to be a meeting taking care or talking about Ross and what he did and the results that go through the pupils and all those people who apply systems thinking. And the other reason why I am here is the fact that I see Jefferson as the continuation of the ideas of Ross. And I think this is going to be the seat of Ross's ideas and the future of those ideas that will take place with all this kind of audience. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you withstand one more Mexican?
All right.
Why? I'm going to I'm going to apologize before I speak, because you might think that I'm going to be very rude, okay? I come here to find out if you guys are ready or not to change the world, okay? I met Russ because Stafford Beer was my friend, and he suggested that I should meet Russ when Russ came to Monterrey after I had met Stafford. So I did meet with Russ several times, the latest time when he was in UNAM. And Stafford and Russ, and I guess I can say that I also share their idea that the world could be changed enormously by applying systems thinking. I went to the Santa Fe Institute in 1994, a couple of days before the big devaluation in Mexico that cost us a lot. We went backwards in poverty and everything because we don't handle systems correctly. Mexico could be richer than the United States. It is not, because what I discovered, by that time I had already written my book on the cybernetic state, just to find out that the cyberneticians are not interested in politics and the politicians are not interested in cybernetics. So the book is just sitting there, doing nothing. All these years, I tried to become president of Mexico. I couldn't make it because I'm a troublemaker, you know. And I want to find out if you guys are troublemakers or not. But yes, if you're not going to change anything. You have to fight. You have to confront people. You have to love conflict. If you guys don't love conflict, I'm sorry to say, you're not going to change anything. Okay? I've been an activist most of my life. I had a piggy bank rather large. I spent it all trying to change my country. I couldn't do it. Now I have to work again. I'm going to consulting or something. And the thing is that I think Russ's ideas and Stafford's ideas are both very powerful. Stafford told me about this rivalry he had with Russ. Russ was pragmatic, and Stafford was more theoretical. And they were both in a tug of war, and I still don't know who is going to prevail. Stafford is all into the complexity thing as something very different that needs a very different language. And Russ has said, we do the thinking, Stafford, and let people just follow our recipes, okay? I still don't know which of the two guys is going to prevail. So I come to meet the people that inherited Russell Ackoff to see if it's not just that you like their ideas, but you want the things that they ultimately wanted is to change the world, save the world from organizations that are totally out of control, whether big governments, big corporations, Boeing, or call it whatever you want, GM, or, you know, they're out of control. And that is the number one issue. It's not so much the people problem, it's the corporations that we create, and then they get their own goals, and they don't obey anybody. So that's why I'm here.
Well, let me close by saying I think Russ's approach is the best one, because if people are not part of the solution, it'll not happen. You can't order people to do things. You have to teach them how to do things. And without getting too protective of General Motors Corporation, it is an entirely different organization today than it was before Russ came and visited, as you could tell by their approach to the environment and things of that nature. So change did take place, and it was a significant change. Whether it's going to be successful or not is yet to be determined, but it was made, yeah. So I think with that, that's it for this session.
Thank you.
Honey? Are we done, John? Yes. Okay. Oh.